Looks like our host has dropped, I presume.
It's possible. He's been kind of coming in and out in waves, so unfortunately. Um,
Uh-huh. I see.
my name is Steve, by the way.
Yeah, I can read. That's the least
Okay.
I can do.
All right. So let's carry on here. We'll wait for Sam to get back up here. So what he was talking about net neutrality.
We're gonna
I'm
start with net neutrality. Okay, fair enough.
I'm not very well versed on the whole topic.
Yeah, well, I
And
am.
okay.
Well,
Um,
it depends on who you ask. I mean, net neutrality, if you ask its supporters, is basically, oh, it's a policy to make sure the uh, various internet service providers don't treat traffic differently. That is to say, treat I don't know the traffic of one company as being more important than the other. If you ask its opponents, such as myself, net neutrality is essentially corporate welfare because it basically means that me as a small business owner with two employees, I pay exactly as much and for the bandwidth as Google, which is completely insane because Google definitely uses far more bandwidth and far more internet infrastructure than I will ever use in 10 lives,
mm,
probably even more than that. So that's basically the actual debate. Now, sadly, as usual with many other policies, the public debate about it is basically you're either for Trump or against Trump, or you're either a racist, sexist, homophobe, corporatist shill, or you're for the people. The funny part about the latter framing is that the individuals who claim to be for the people, i.e., for net neutrality, they're actually the corporatist shills because if you look at the biggest supporters of the policy, what are the Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook, Google? These are the biggest supporters of net neutrality.
hold
Um,
on. Hold
they're
on
not
for a
the
moment.
consumers associations. They're not the no. And there's
Okay.
also, of course, the question of whether net neutrality has any value whatsoever other than the corporate welfare value. And the answer is a little bit more murky. I mean, you'll hear some opponents of net neutrality saying, yeah, with that, no use whatsoever. Well, yes and no. I mean, there are many countries that have much faster and cheaper internet than the United States that never had net neutrality, such as my own. The average internet speed in my country, on cable anyway, is about 85 to 90 megabits per second. For instance, in my own
Mm,
household is 300 megabits per second. That's something that most Americans can't even begin to imagine. Um,
no, they
but on
can't.
the other hand,
From
so as I said, there is a much more nuanced and admittedly somewhat technical debate on whether net neutrality has any practical use whatsoever in terms of how internet works. Now, the advocates of net neutrality, they say, look at Portugal, what a mess it is because they don't have net neutrality and they have those some very old ads that actually no longer exist, and with some companies that no longer exist. But anyway, they picked up a much older ad that said, "Oh, look, it's only €5, but only if you use these particular websites, and you have to pay a lot more to use everything." That's actually, I mean, it was never true, but yes, there was a moment when Portugal's entire bandwidth was much more limited than it is now. That you would indeed get, for instance, 5 megabits per second while accessing, I don't know, CNN.com, for instance, but only, I don't know, half a megabit per second when accessing some obscure website that no one really cares about.
mm,
That was actually what was happening. It was not that the websites not on those lists were forbidden or anything. It just meant that, at least in theory, they would work slower. Now, of course, all of that was solved a long time ago as bandwidth grew and grew and grew because there was no regulation to stop it, like it is the case in the United States. That nowadays there is literally no tangible influence, tangible difference. Sorry. Such is the case, for instance, in my own country. I explained this 2.5 years ago in a video called "Why is Internet in Romania so damn fast?" That has went viral somewhat ish. Um, and it's basically the difference here is something like if I want to access the sports portal where the live broadcast football matches of the carrier that is also my internet service provider, getting to their portal and start watching matches can take up to maybe 2.5 seconds. Whereas if I want to access the competition of my carrier, it may take 2.65, maybe 2.7 seconds. So that's basically the only difference. If there had been net neutrality, yes, the government would force them both to load in 2.5 seconds. But in reality, if there had been any net neutrality in this country, actually both of them would have ended up being loaded at 3.2 seconds or something like that. Because it eventually, by forcing everyone to at least act equally, that means either companies will try to subvert the regulation as they did in the United States, or they're going to enforce it rigidly, which means bandwidth goes unused, and it forces everyone to work slower at a much slower pace than the industry requires it. So yeah, the and I can understand Americans supporting net neutrality, thinking, "Oh, Verizon, we're gonna screw us over," or AT&T is going to screw us over, and whatnot. That's a legitimate theme. The problem is that that doesn't have anything to do with net neutrality. If Verizon wants to screw you over, they can do it right now with net neutrality. The problem in the United States is the untold and maybe enormous amount of regulations that hamper infrastructure development. And that until that is solved, and it cannot be solved by the federal government, uh, it can only be solved by state governments and city halls and so on and so forth. Until that is solved, it is going to continue to be this way with or without net neutrality. In terms of speeds and ethical or non-ethical behavior by the companies towards the customers, nothing will change regardless of whether net neutrality stays or goes.
Okay, so it's not the demon that it appears to be, is what you're saying.
Now, I said earlier, but you were restarting your computers. Net neutrality is essentially corporate welfare. It forces people like me, small business owners, to pay exactly as much for bandwidth as Google, regardless of the fact that Google is going to use in a minute more bandwidth that I'm going to use in 10 lives. So essentially, if net neutrality were to be abolished and I were to be a small business owner in the United States, my internet bandwidth bill would shrink and Google's would increase. And I see nothing wrong with that. I think it is inherently corporatist to try to pretend that everyone is the same, but everyone is not the same. And of course, there is the underlying assumption here from the pro net neutrality advocates that transmitting data is essentially no cost, or that well, who cares, 1 or 2 gigabytes extra, it's just marginal, no cost. It's not. It's not. The traffic is not equal. Seeing a picture from a server in Japan costs a lot more than seeing a picture from the server that is right in the same room from where I'm broadcasting. The traffic is not the same.
Interesting. Because the press over here has been
Think about it. How many equipments have to work, being stay 24/7 plugged in and consume electricity and whatnot, just so I can view the picture from Japan, versus how many equipments have to stay plugged in just so I can view the picture from the server from next door, or maybe from 100 kilometers from here. Much fewer.
hmm. Okay, so one of the things I was actually going to propose here, and I think Lucian is probably in a much better position to comment on this, although I don't know how familiar he is with the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, I am quite familiar.
Um,
Test me.
okay, the idea of having net neutrality brought into the Constitution. What would be your opinion on that? Because this is a ridiculous. I'm glad you brought it on, because you bringing a whole different take on this.
I think is insane.
I hadn't considered before.
And not just I think it's insane, I think it would run contrary to what the founders intended. The founders never intended equality of outcome nor corporate welfare. That's one aspect.
Oh,
Second aspect,
happy there, yeah.
and second aspect, good luck getting to what is 3/4 of the states or 2/3 of the states that have to ratify it and put it in as an amendment. And besides, let's not get into all the legal ramifications. I mean, it says what? Congress shall pass no law concerning the neutrality of the internet. I mean, no. No, I think the whole idea is very ludicrous, not just from a theoretical standpoint. Again, it runs contrary to to everything the founders intended for the United States. But it is also from a practical standpoint, essentially impossible. I mean, convincing also all that many legislatures and whatnot, not to mention some states have referenda on whether it should be approved or not. Some states won't. And besides, again, let's not forget who are the biggest supporters of net neutrality. They're not small businesses. They're not consumers. They're not. No, there are essentially two categories of people: freeloaders, both of them. One of them big corporations, and one of them the people like us who spend a lot of time on the internet and we stream a lot and we consume a lot of bandwidth. um, and of course for people like us, it's amazing that a grandma who only checks her emails twice a month gets to pay as much as we do, even though we use sometimes 100,000 times more than she does. So that's essentially the argument. The favors, the supporters of net neutrality are those who directly benefit from it, or at least they think they benefit, because the consumer doesn't benefit that much. It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Alphabet, it's Microsoft. These are the companies that benefit the most from net neutrality. It's not small businesses, it's not medium-sized businesses. And again, there are so many countries out there outside the United States that never had net neutrality and have much faster internet, much more stable market and whatnot. Sure, it's not that big as the American one, but then again, most countries in the world are smaller than the United States, so there's that. But still, I mean, think about it. Israel, for instance. Israel is having its own increasing Silicon Valley that's and actual VCs from Silicon Valley are moving there to Tel Aviv because the business environment is much more friendly than California ever was. They never
Oh
had
well,
net.
yeah. There's massive problems coming out of California at this point.
Of course, of course, of course. The thing is that Israel never had a net neutrality. And as I was explaining earlier, in my country, there never was net neutrality, and the internet is 10 times faster than the average American one. There is no practical argument for net neutrality. There are these kinds of wishy-washy arguments. They feel good arguments, because I understand it feels good. Yeah, everyone should be treated equally and whatnot. The problem is that we're not equal. We're just not.